Εδώ ραδιοφωνικός σταθμός Αθηνών, επιμεσαίων κυμάτων, συχνότητος 728 χιλιοκύκλων ανά δευτερόλεπτον ή μήκους 412 μέτρων.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Milton Experience, the podcast that aims to edify, entertain, and enthrall its listeners. Recently, I returned to Athens. While there, I spent my evenings strolling through Plaka, taking a small ouzo at the foot of the Acropolis, and asking after old acquaintances. Alas, central Athens is now one gigantic Airbnb. The little neighborhood Psilikadzidiko has given way to foul-smelling vape emporia, lit by surgical neon. At the Cafe Neon, venerable pensioners and their backgammon boards have been driven out by a table of digital nomads, loudly discussing some agentic AI startup. The Greeks themselves are not in Athens, having been priced out by the dreaded lockbox, banished to suburbs I shall not deign to name. The frenetic growth of the so-called hospitality industry has of course spread far beyond the mainland and onto the world-famous islands of the Aegean. A particularly egregious example, of course, is Mykonos, which has been overrun by the most disgusting and vulgar nouveau riche from all over. Yachts so vast they cannot enter the harbour. Sunbeds at €600 a day. Wax-like faces, distorted by fillers and Botox, and money the provenance of which I shudder to investigate. This carnival of vulgarity leaves me revolted and disoriented. I find myself in need of ballast, some civilized reminder of what it once meant to discover Greece, before the visitor had been degraded into the tourist. There was a time when one came to Greece to be instructed by it, and not just to consume it. So, let us go back, past the lewd drunken crowds and the beloved all-inclusive resorts, back to the age when an English gentleman crossed to the continent to acquire Polish antiquities and enough foreigners to keep up with the proverbial Joneses. The Grand Tour coalesced in the 17th century from older traditions of educational travel, then reached its full absurd splendor in the 18th. By that point in time, the recipe was simple. Take one young Englishman of some means, then send him to Oxford or Cambridge, or at the very least, furnish him with Latin, a tolerable constitution, and the unbridled confidence of a family that has spent 6 centuries never explaining itself. Then attach a new, specialized tutor, nominally for moral instruction, actually to prevent his protégé from acquiring an unsuitable wife, an embarrassing disease, or an enthusiasm for Monsieur Voltaire. Once prepared, dispatch the young gentleman to the continent for at least a year, often 2 or 3, and sometimes longer. Send the gentleman to Paris for manners, fashion, fencing, and dancing. Then off to Switzerland he goes for discipline, health, and some Protestant respectability. Then Italy, almost always Italy. Roma for antiquity, Firenze for the Renaissance, Venezia for the atmosphere, Napoli for Vesuvius, Herculaneum, and Pompeii. So, where does Greece enter the picture? Greece itself was usually outside the standard recipe. It was, after all, Ottoman territory, and for most grand tourists, Italy was enough. Greek sculpture could still be admired through Roman copies. And yet, some hardier specimens of grand tourists did sail on to Greece and to Constantinople. In the early 1730s, an assortment of British grand tourists in London formed the Society of Dilettanti. James Stewart, later known as Athenian Stewart, and Nicholas Revet went to Athens in 1751. The first volume of their folio work, The Antiquities of Athens, appeared in 1762. In 1764, the Dilettanti funded another expedition. This time, Richard Chandler, Revet again, and William Paz set out for Ionia and Greece, reaching Athens on the 31st of August, 1765. They treated the monuments above all as architecture, to be measured, drawn and published, not merely admired as scenery. Then came the Romantics, and, inevitably, Byron. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage appeared in 1812, made Byron famous almost before the ink had dried, and helped turn Ottoman-ruled Greece into a place worth grieving over in public. The Greeks rose in revolt in 1821. Byron sailed for Greece in 1823, reached Missolonghi in January 1824, caught a fever that April, and died there on the 19th. Handsome of him to spend his money and person on the Greek cause. Less handsome of him to remain, even in death, the most ostentatious man in any room he entered. 1827 at Navarino. British, French, and Russian squadrons destroyed much of the Turco-Egyptian fleets in the bay. In 1830, Greece was recognized as independent. In 1832, the Great Powers finished arranging the new kingdom, its frontiers and monarch. Athens replaced Nafplion as capital in 1834. The Turkish garrison had withdrawn from the Acropolis the previous year. The rock was henceforth treated by royal decree as an archaeological site. The journey to Greece was no longer reserved for the hardiest aficionados. Greece was becoming more legible, safer, and more standardized for the gentleman, the scholar, and the traveler of taste. And this, the idea of travel for everyone, brings us to Thomas Cook, a name one pronounces with a certain fatigue. Derbyshire-born, Baptist, temperance campaigner, a man of unimpeachable moral seriousness. In 1841, he arranged a special train from Leicester to Loughborough for a temperance gathering. Roughly a dozen miles, about 500 passengers, paying 1 shilling a head. After a first continental excursion in 1855, Thomas Cook advertised a grand circular tour of the continent in 1856. Brussels, Cologne, the Rhine, Paris. By 1869, the itinerary had reached Egypt and Palestine, something like the Crusades but with timetables and souvenirs. By the mid-1880s, Thomas Cook had offices in Athens and Constantinople, and was offering excursions to Greece and Turkey. Thomas Cook's innovation had created a new creature, the traveler who could move faster than he could understand. He needed help. This help came in a new form, the travel guidebook. One of the foremost was the work of a German publisher named Karl Baedeker. You can trust the Teutons to organize information about any human endeavor with such pedantry as to suck the very life and spontaneity from it. Baedeker's pocket-sized red books supplied this new breed of traveller with route, tariff, and opinion. The Greece volume appeared in German in 1883. The English translation, to which I shall be referring throughout this series, in 1889. In his preface, Baedeker is very direct. He aims to, and I quote, supply the traveller with the most necessary information regarding the history, the culture of the people who's about to visit, to render him as independent as possible of the services of couriers, guides, and commissionaires, to protect him against extortion, and in every way to aid him in deriving enjoyment and instruction from his tour in one of the most profoundly interesting countries in the world. Why, thank you, Mr. Baedeker. You make us all blush. It is 1890. Take one respectable London gentleman of sound nerves, a serviceable acquaintance with the cities, and no pressing need to be likeable. He has resolved to visit Athens and its environs. What must he take? Whom must he distrust? What must he eat, drink, avoid, endure? From the outset, Baedeker engages in what modern corporate idiolects could call expectation management. According to Baedeker, the gentleman fresh from the noble galleries of Rome and Naples will find the Greek works terribly dilapidated, and the museums warehouse-like. The gentleman must bring some capacity for sympathetic appreciation of southern scenery, and learn to admire what Baedeker calls its severe harmony of colors: bare mountains, deep blue gulfs, clear air, and no northern softness. But first, he must arrive. Baedeker is plain about the journey. Athens, thanks to modern railways and steamers, has been brought within 4 days of London. 4 days. 60 hours from London to Brindisi. That would be 24 by today's high-speed trains. 14 more by steamer to Corfu, another 16 to Patras. The smaller Greek coasting steamers, Baedeker concedes, require fortitude. They are usually very poorly appointed. On almost all of these vessels, the want of order and discipline is particularly disagreeable. Steerage passengers, in defiance of the nominal prohibition, occasionally invade the afterdeck, more picturesque at a distance than agreeable at close quarters. Then there's a new railway. Corinth in 4.5 hours, Athens in 9. Mr. Trikoupis, Greece's great apostle of railways and canals, had not laboured entirely in vain. Greece had now been compressed into a timetable. Apropos time. Baedeker warns that the Julian calendar, which is 12 days behind the Gregorian, is still followed in Greece. January the 1st in Athens is January the 13th in London. One leaves by Bradshaw's Railway Guide and arrives in the world of Plato, having mislaid a fortnight somewhere in the Ionian Sea. Papers next. A passport is not demanded from the traveller either on entering or leaving Greece, says Baedeker, before adding, with Germanic sobriety, that it will often be useful, especially in the interior. Registered letters, Baedeker notes, will not be handed over without proof of identity, and the countenance of the British and American consuls likewise depends on the proof of nationality the traveller can produce. The gentleman must be able to demonstrate that he is who he claims to be, English, solvent, and entitled to be mildly inconvenienced. Then money. Greece had joined the Latin Monetary League in 1871, but owing to the unsatisfactory financial position of the country, the currency now consisted almost entirely of paper. However, when one did come across coins, the franc and the drachme might be taken as one. Likewise, the French centime and the lepton. For larger sums, Baedeker recommends French or English gold, letters of credit, English banknotes, or so-called circular notes, which were apparently an early form of traveller checks. French and German banknotes, on the other hand, he warns, are not favourably received. English gold always commands ready acceptance. Of course it does. There are few places in the 19th century where a gold sovereign does not enter the room before its owner. In Athens, Corfu, and the places reached by railway, Baedeker is reassuring. One needs make no more preparation than for a tour in Italy. Beyond the railway, however, civilization thins somewhat. In the interior, horseback remains the common mode of travel. The inns may call themselves xenodochia. They are often content with a humbler title of khans. Baedeker describes a miserable cottage, a kitchen, one common sleeping room, and the occasional separate chamber without furniture, glass windows, or fireplaces. The traveller must bring coverings. The rugs presented by the hotel owners, so to say, as bedclothes, are almost always full of vermin and also apt to be scanty. The traveller carries, therefore, a sleeping bag of linen or cotton cloth, tying tightly round the neck. Fleas, bedbugs, lice, and other disgusting insects, winged and wingless, are omnipresent. Mosquitoes, Cnupia, overspread the low districts in the summer, Baedeker helpfully informs us. Against these terrible pests, the traveller is advised to deploy so-called Persian or Keating's insect powder, which is, upon arrival, plentifully sprinkled on the traveller's clothes and bedding. Now, Keating's insect powder sounds like the sort of Victorian preparation that could double as poisoned for unlikable mothers-in-law. However, Baedeker is honest enough to admit that powders are not sufficient. The only effectual preventives are thin muslin curtains, cunupieres, spread over the bed. Now, the traveller venturing into the interior of Greece is expected to come even better and further equipped. Baedeker prescribes a travelling flask and drinking cup, a knife large enough to be used in eating if necessary, candles for evening use, and a good compass. He further recommends a stout cane or long riding whip, useful, he says, in repelling the village and shepherd's dogs. Well, hello, Mr. Indiana Jones. Welcome to Greece. Now, of course, travel isn't just about fighting noxious pests. One also needs to sustain oneself. Baedeker begins with a traveller who lodges in the larger Athenian hotels and has little need to make acquaintance with the Greek restaurants. The usual arrangement is a fixed daily charge called pension or pension, probably, in those days, 10 to 15 francs, according to the season, covering the room, breakfast, luncheon, and dinner. In second-class houses, the room is cheaper, but meals are taken à la carte. There, our gentleman requires some vocabulary. Super avgolemono, soup with egg and lemon. Zuzukakia, with double z. Dumplings with garlic. Tulumotiri, goat's milk cheese. Psito vidello, roast beef apparently. Sambuni, ham, and so-called rodanica, which is supposed to be peaches, although this looks more like a typographical error. At the restaurant, dinner runs from 11 to 2, supper from 6 to 8. Sometimes the meal is also offered at a fixed price of 3 to 5 francs or drachmae. In the principal Athenian establishments, the cuisine is half French. Gratuities or tips are not customary. The waiter is a pedie, and a portion is a merida. The latter remains useful even today. The former is best left in Baedeker, unless of course one wishes to sound as though summoning a child. The ordinary wine of Greece, Baedeker says, is impregnated with resin, partly to increase its keeping power, and partly from a curious freak of taste. The flavor is especially strong in the rezzinato of Attica, which foreigners rarely learn to appreciate. For those defeated by the resin, Baedeker offers a refuge. Kivisia, an unresined red wine served in Athens, Corfu, and on Greek steamer vessels. It is, he says, the ordinary beverage of foreigners, and its flavor is somewhat insipid and weak. Better varieties exist. Solonos, Pezzali, Theophilatu, Moraitu, but most are too fiery for regular use. The gentleman thus chooses accordingly between the resinous, the dilute, and the incendiary. Greek eating houses fare badly. Baedeker calls them dirty and says the bill of fare does not commend itself to the unacclimatized palate. Native beer he dismisses as usually undrinkable. Nevertheless, he does recommend a few good addresses, so to say. One is called, apparently, Guglielmos, near the aptly named Hôtel des Étrangers. Another is called Emmanuel, between the Church of St. George and the Rue du Stade, which of course nowadays is Odos Stadiou. Last but not least, a name that remains recognizable, namely Fix's Brewery, at the south base of the Lycabettos. Coffee, thankfully, is more palatable. Baedeker says it is generally good, served in the oriental manner, in small cups with the grounds. It is usually already sweetened, café glicot. The visitor may order café metrio with little sugar, or café schietto with none. It must, of course, first cool down and settle, then be drunk carefully so as not to disturb the sediment. The accompaniments of the coffee remain recognizable even today. Lucumi, a sweetened gum, and rosewater offer with pistachio nuts. Masticha, distilled from the gum of the mastics, forming a milky opalescent fluid when mixed with water. For the finer provisions, Baedeker singles out one establishment, namely Pavlidis, in the Rue des Halles, opposite the church of Christos Piliotissa. There, the traveller can find chocolates, lucumi, and honey from Mount Hymettos in hermetically sealed tins. French spoken at the shop, which of course is the bare minimum to be expected from a high-end 19th century patisserie-confiserie. Cigarettes are cheap. Ordinary tobacco costs 30 to 40 centimes or lepta. Add to that a book of high-quality French cigarette papers at 30 centimes. Cigars, on the other hand, are expensive and good only in Athens, Patras, Volo, and a few other large towns. Elsewhere, according to Baedeker, very bad. Then we have the nargile, or water pipe, charged with Persian tumbeki. It demands effort and at first produces a somewhat stupefying effect. Seasoned smokers swallow the smoke. Baedeker warns that even when it is expelled again at once, this practice produces effects similar to the use of opium. Last but not least, our gentleman will definitely need some hydration. Baedeker declares the water of Greece, except in the mountains, seldom thoroughly pure or wholesome. The traveller should quench his thirst mainly with wine, tea, coffee, and the like. The same resinous wine, which causes quite a bit of aversion in earlier parts of the book, is especially praised by those used its flavour, especially in stomachic derangements occasioned by the unusual food. Against fever, a moderate use of spirits is said to be a prophylactic. Wine for the stomach, spirits for the fever. That is how it was done back before colossal pharmaceutical conglomerates had taken over our dreary and miserable lives. But I digress. Let us return to our gentleman traveller, who, for the moment, is fed, fumigated, and generally forewarned. He has muslin against the dangers of the night, resin against the stomach ills, and possibly private doubts about the water pipes and tumbeki. And yet, his adventures have only just begun. He has yet to face the dragoman with his contracts, the papas with his card games, and the provincial hosts whose hospitality has a special monetary arithmetic of its own. But all that, and quite a bit more, shall be the subject of the next installment of this series on 19th century travel to Greece. Until then, toodle-pip.